Diasporas are clever. They have radars. Their BS radar is pretty strong. If you come in with a transactional mindset this many a mile away, you know.
That's Dr. Martin Russell. His expertise, philanthropy, networking, and above all, diaspora. He's the co-founder, along with our past guest, Kingsley Akins, of the Diaspora Institute, working globally to advance the art and science of diaspora engagement. He's built a career out of turning academic theory into practical tactics. He advised on Ireland's new diaspora strategy, and he works with diaspora communities from Albania to Cabo Verde, which in a way is where we start the discussion on the event where the diasporas of Cabo Verde and so many other countries represented their ancestral homelands on the biggest of world stages. Here's our conversation with Dr. Martin Russell. Welcome, Dr. Martin Russell.
Thank you. Great to be here, folks.
We feel our Irish Stew efforts here have a lot to do with diaspora engagement, so it's great to talk to such a renowned thought leader in the field. If you can blush when I say that to you. But right now, global sporting focus is on stadiums in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Great football tournament going on. You're an avid football fan, I know. But let's look at this World Cup through your professional lens as the Diaspora World Cup. What are some of the diaspora themes and stories that you see coming out of this World Cup?
Look, firstly, folks, it's great to be here, so thanks for the invite. And before I go to the question, my one vice in life is that I'm a season ticket holder at Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, so it's a character building. Look, I think it's phenomenal. I just landed in Boston a few days ago, and we were just talking about the impact of the Tartan Army in Scotland. I think there's diplomatic, cultural, community-driven connections that are going to come out of this, but it's kind of layered across the World Cup when you look at the word of diaspora. So I think there's a sports diplomacy piece of it, but I think also when you begin to look at the composition of the teams, for example, you have diaspora stories all over that. So it shows the power of diaspora talent as well at an elite level in sport. So I think it's shone a light on the topic. And I think it was a week ago, the New York Times have a collaboration with The Athletic. And in their recap of one of the days, the question they put out was, is this World Cup the Diaspora World Cup? I nearly fell off my seat when I saw that in terms of a publication like that. So look, I think it's just shining a light in a way that we can understand the community-driven impact of it. And to be honest, look, lads, we live in a world that's pretty confused, divisive at the minute. And it shows the magic of sport to help actually bring communities together. So I'm all for it. The challenge now is how do you take it from an event and build it as a legacy? And I think the interesting headline for me over the last week or so was the quick action to build a collaboration between the city of Boston and Glasgow, for example. I know that there's an organisation, for example, called Global Scot, which is a network of Scottish leaders around the world, particularly in industry, but different elements of society. And I think they played a role in that. So it's on the field, it's in the stands, but it's in the political corridors as well, which is important.
And there are teams that wouldn't be in these games without the diaspora. They're largely diaspora teams. We also saw that in the World Baseball Classic. Almost every Italian player was a U.S. player of Italian heritage. And as far as the World Cup stories, my favorite is the story of the single greatest someone finding a job through LinkedIn story of Pico Lopes, who got a message in Portuguese on his LinkedIn profile, is now playing for Cape Verde, Shamrock Rovers player. It's a great story.
It's unbelievable. I was lucky enough to actually go to Cabo Verde a couple of years ago, and the connections that can be built out of that, even with an Irish hat on, in terms of the story. And to be honest, look, I think with the Irish sporting story, back to the last time the World Cup was in this part of the world, Jack Charlton and the boys in green had a lot of diaspora players on the pitch back then, so it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. And I think more importantly, it's not just in football either. I think it's important that we broaden it out. So myself and my brother last year, we went on a bit of a trip of a lifetime to see Oasis in California, and we were in the hotel, and is it the Dodgers and is it Ohtani, the baseball player?
Yeah.
And you see the community travelling from Asia to see this chap. And I mentioned Tottenham earlier. We had a player up to last year called Son Heung-min, who's now in, I think, LA, and you go to the stadium every week and there's thousands of Koreans coming in to see this guy. So sports teams understand the power of this in more ways than one, both in terms of talent, but there's a phenomenal commercial and supporting based opportunity to build out globally. I think we're just at the beginning.
Another example of that, I was struck by watching the Iranian opening game in the World Cup, which was played in LA, and the amount of support for the Iranian team in America was totally obvious. And of course, anybody that knows anything about that community knows there's a huge Iranian community in Los Angeles. To me, it was an example of sports transcending political difficulty, that this community was coming together to support the men that were playing for Iran. They were not talking about the conflict between the US. It was quite eye-opening and spoke to me about the strength and power of sport.
It's fascinating. I opened up by saying I'm a fan of Tottenham. That's part of my belonging, identifying myself as being part of that tribe, if you will. And I think as well, that power of belonging took depoliticized. And I think we have to get back to the basics. That's really looking at what community-led empowerment and the erosion of division looks like. So I'm involved in a think tank called the Institute for Integrated Transitions that looks at areas of conflict and fragility and transition. And there's a professor involved in that, and he wrote a book on fragile neighbourhoods, is the title of the book. And I think it's very telling. When you look at some of the solutions, sometimes we can over-engineer. Get that? I shouldn't say that as someone with an academic background. It probably put me out of a job. So overthinking things. But it is the power of sport, not just in terms of politics, but bringing communities together and really getting back to the social fabric of how can we energise belonging across communities. We're not different to each other.
Yeah, we can focus on what separates us, or we can focus on what brings us together. For me, the latter is far more constructive activity. And I notice you used the word belonging, and we're going to talk about belonging because I think that's core to the diaspora, but I'd like to talk about your own origins. So let's start off with your county affiliation.
I think the accent gives it away.
Well, maybe not for our American listeners then.
Because I look proud Corkonian, born and bred, and that will be core to who I am for the rest of my life. And joking aside, I was with a friend of mine with the accent who works in the AI, and he said, Martin, you're lucky that your accent will be the only one that AI won't be able to decipher. My own story, just in terms of my personal and professional trajectory, I like to describe myself as a bit of a reluctant academic at heart. So I went to college first actually to study mathematics, which is something that not many people know. But I was lucky enough to meet a history professor in UCC who read something I wrote. He probably saw something in it that I didn't see myself. And he said, forget the mathematics and go that way. So I actually ended up looking at the role of the Irish diaspora in the peace process in the north of Ireland, and testament to the work that you folks are doing as well. One of the areas I looked at in that journey was the power of diaspora media, which I think has been greatly underappreciated for many years in terms of how it can bring a community to a point of commonality that you just spoke about, Martin, because I think the way in which we tell our stories as communities are important. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that when I did that research, I was talking about Irish American newspapers and not podcasts, social media and everything that goes with it. So I looked at diaspora media, diaspora philanthropy, and diaspora politics/diplomacy. So I genuinely fell in love with the concept of diaspora at that point. I saw what it did for my own island, north and south, and I just thought to myself, there's something inherently beautiful in this, if we can get it going, to be honest, because I think we had my colleague Kingsley on a few years ago. We have a standard joke between ourselves that when we began this work and we began talking about the word diaspora, people thought it was a tablet you take for a headache. Not many people knew what it was. And it was for certain countries, it was part of the mainstay vocabulary, but for others, it was like completely new. So look, just in terms of the trajectory over the last kind of 10 to 15, 20 years and to how I ended up maybe in this seat, my crazy dream is that Ireland could be a global leader on this, but I want to share what we do with the world. So we were joking earlier, look, I've been living out of a suitcase for the last kind of 10 to 15 years. So we've worked across Africa, across Latin and Central America, across the Caribbean, a little bit in Asia, a little bit in Ireland in terms of the work. But that's me in a nutshell, a bit of a boring academic. I'm happiest in the library when I can switch off from the world and read and think and explore. But I also know that we have to get out into the field and take that thinking and learning into practice.
The timing was probably relatively good because you have the Department of Foreign Affairs in 2014 sets up a junior ministry focused on diaspora. And even before that, you have the Immigrant Support Program, which I believe dates to about 2006. So it seems like you've arrived in a sweet spot.
Can I ask you, before we move on, to go back to the peace process? Things are in a difficult impasse in the north at the moment, and it's part of a difficulty throughout Europe, the U.S., with diasporas entering their country in a sense. Is there anything that you learned from the American diaspora's impact on the peace process then that could be applied to what's going on today?
One layer of the answer, and then I'll unpack it. I think we have to understand that there's different types of diaspora engagement, and there's different opportunities and processes and impacts that could become across that different type of diaspora engagement. So how you would engage in terms of a mass community communication mobilization piece in diaspora media would be fundamentally different to the type of work that would happen, for example, through what we would call networks of affluence and influence in diaspora diplomacy. So I think what we also have to do is how do we identify and encourage people, or maybe we'll unpack this later, lads, as well. I think power has fundamentally shifted in the world. So I think how we begin to think about diaspora engagement getting applied in response to what you're talking about would have to reflect that as well. So we have a mile wide, inch deep types of diaspora engagement, but then you also have the inch wide, mile deep, for want of a better word, real kind of power brokers in your community. And they can do that discreetly rather than publicly. So that's what I would hint at, in a sense of what we could do is that we have a different opportunity now in terms of how power is flowing and configured. And it was always that way, John, to be honest. It was just never said. You just sense where it's going, but now it's blatantly said. So part of it is reacting to that model. And this is one of the things I've been learning actually from my visit this week as well. What's banging around in the back of my head is that how are we actually going to reinvest in the infrastructure of the community in the US as well? I think we have really great foundations, but I think there's a bit of creative thinking needed to re-energize that. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah.
Just thinking about lean into your old fascination of mathematics, I will confess to an interest in data. And one number that's always trotted out is 70 million, meaning people self-identifying as Irish, that's 70 million being the total diaspora. Tell me about that number. Are you comfortable with that number? And does the number matter?
Yeah, the context to that, Martin, is definition. Ireland is pretty inclusive in how we define a diaspora, and I think that's great. But if you're translating that definition to the practicalities of engaging, and to answer your question on does the number matter, I think it's a very powerful story to tell. And you can relay the impact of the global Irish family on different elements of the world that we're in. Not all industry, political, but I think in terms of humanitarianism, I think in our culture of giving and standing up for what's right. So I think it's important on that end, in the sense that it gives us a really powerful story to tell. But I think if you're talking about cold-hearted engagement and the people that will want to engage, that number is not as significant as you might think. You always have a dormant majority in your diaspora. You tend to have people that can be very active and committed and passionate, but you have a lot of people that aren't. And part of it is, can you engage those folks to see if they're interested in doing it? And for some, they won't want to be engaged, and that's okay. So quick answer on the number is, I think on one level it matters for the story that we could tell and the projection of our influence in the world, which I think is becoming more pressing, that we get better at that in terms of what we're doing internationally. But also then in terms of the practicalities of engagement, you're looking at a fraction of that number.
So I think of bitterness,
Yeah.
and Irish history is filled with that. But I think of my own story, my becoming part of that diaspora, and I see myself as that even though I was Irish born. I've been living in America for over 40 years. My entry was easy because I came here on athletic scholarship in the 1980s, but many of my peers came here out of economic need. And now I think to the present, where now there's a new diaspora being generated, not because of economic opportunity in terms of employment back in Ireland, but because of affordability. Is bitterness something that you look at in this context? I know it's a negative word, but I don't think you can escape it in a way.
No, you have to be upfront on it. And look, my entry point actually, I was fascinated by your phrase of becoming a diaspora. It's an interesting way of looking at it, because look, before I unpack that, my entry point to diaspora was actually exploring collective memory. Because we often talk about diaspora as imagined communities. Some of the literature talks about imagined communities. And the collective memory of it, that is there, and that bitterness can be there. And look, I've also worked with diasporas in a non-Irish context that have maybe been born out of conflict, that have been born out of political persecution. And I promise you, lads, I sat around the table with these folks, and that is real, and it can be a barrier to engagement. When you talk about becoming a diaspora and the diaspora wanting to engage with Ireland, that doesn't automatically mean engaging with government. It means we're engaging with something that's happening in Ireland, and government is part of that, but it doesn't have to be government. You look at organisations that have survived and thrived in this part of the world, like the Ireland funds. Government is at the edges of it, but they're not in the heart of it. So I think that piece of it, the bitterness, if it is real, there's still ways in which you can communicate on it. You can't let it fester, because it will actually be detrimental to the community as it goes. But I think if you can actually provide pathways in which they can engage in different arenas, whether it's culture, sport, music, food, whatever it is, don't correlate just to the state. I think that's important. And look, my colleague Kingsley says this much more eloquently than I ever can. And he says there's a distinction between the state and the nation, with the state being lines on a map and the nation being a global notion. And so what I would say to communities as well that maybe have that bitterness, the migratory journey, but also the generational engagements that build out of that, it's a tough enough journey that don't let the bitterness stop you helping yourself as well in terms of building it out in the community.
And I was going to just bring up Kingsley Aiken's name. We've had him on, and I know you've both worked together on both the networking and the diaspora and how those two things intersect. But he brought up the idea that diaspora is a non-competitive business. Said what they're doing in Ghana for their diaspora doesn't impact what they're doing in Ireland for the diaspora. And he also put out the idea that Ireland should be a leader in promulgating this mental technology of diaspora. Where are you working? Where are you seeing interest? And what are some of the other countries in the world that are embracing this vision?
This links to something you said earlier, Martin, in a sense of coming at the right time. This topic has exploded over the last 5, 10, 15 years. I'll come to what they're interested in a moment, but the data tells us that. For example, back to the fascination with data, we need to have that evidence to back it up. So there's something called the EU Global Diaspora Facility, which is a facility that kind of does more work in the developing or emerging markets context, maybe rather than advanced economies. But they did a baseline, preliminary level research, to be frank, on scoping diaspora engagement globally as part of their project. So they looked at diaspora engagement in 120 countries. They found at least 80 of those countries had at least one central government institution / kind of ministry entity responsible for it. Across public and semi-public formats, they found over 540 organizations working on it, and they identified kind of 7 or 8 key areas. So it could be something from consular services to cultural diplomacy to economic diplomacy. If you told me, just layering it back into our work, we do a lot of collaboration and conversations with companies like LinkedIn on this stuff. That wasn't happening 10, 15 years ago on this topic. I think we're at a stage of the sector where there's been incredible foundations built. I think we're seeing a real diversification of the type of actors. Kind of the phrase I use is sniffing an interest at the minute. They're dipping the toe in the water, whether they're jumping full in. At the moment, I think we still have a bit to go on that. But we also need to inspire them to do that. And coming back to your point about interest areas of other governments, it tends to be geographic specific, for example. But I do know for a fact in the development finance landscape that is now ruptured in a pretty fundamental way. And the US is not alone in terms of their thinking on this. The UK government are cutting back, the French government are cutting. It's not US specific. I know for a fact that countries, for example, across emerging markets are now prioritising diaspora engagement in terms of talent and investment. So the frame that I put forward to governments, particularly when I'm working around the world, is other partners come and go. Fine, that's the nature of life. But your diaspora are a community of consistency if you do it well.
Is there an area of the world, a country that you're excited to see what's going on and you're maybe have a role in?
A country that's absolutely taking off in this. I don't have a role. I'd love to have a role, so if anybody's listening. I think India have done phenomenal stuff in this. I think when you look at other countries, and when you say excited to be part of it, it's all relative to the impact it can have. I've done a lot of work, for example, in Albania, Kosovo, that part of the world. It's impactful. They mightn't have the numbers, but for what you're looking at in terms of impact for those communities and societies, it's been mind-blowing to see.
I just ran into the Albanian Day Parade in my neighborhood, and I said, who knew? I had no idea Albania had a parade. A lot of Albanians
It's
here,
unbelievable. It's related to what we said earlier about the different types of diaspora engagement. So I'll give them a shout out. One of the most quiet champions that I've ever come across of the Albanian diaspora in the US is a guy called Mark Cosmo. He's based out of Boston. A funny story, lads, actually. I had never told this publicly.
We like those stories.
So I was doing a talk at Boston University years ago at the African Studies Centre, and the professor came up to me beforehand. She said, "There's 3 Albanians here to see you." And I was like, "The African Studies Centre, Albanians?" But it shows the non-competitive piece of it. So we had done some work in Albania, but Mark saw something much bigger. And I think it's important that even our work, in terms of the type of work that we do, the more you listen to the community, they'll tell you where they want to go. And there's nuggets of vision out there that could be quite transformational. So he's led a whole movement and created the Global Albanian Foundation that is now driving social change and impact back home in Albania. And I think what you're talking about becoming a diaspora as well. And this is where we have to situate diaspora in other non-diaspora movements and contexts, I think, to fully unlock it in terms of where we're going. So I also look at, whether we like it or not, it's a reality. Look, the concentration of wealth and influence tends to be people a little bit later in life. But when you enter that stage of your life of becoming more aware of your departure lounge, as they say, that's where you begin to ask yourself different questions. And I've sat down with diasporas from all over the world, and that's been consistent. And they begin to ask themselves, where am I from? What's my legacy going to be? They begin looking at their children, their grandchildren, and there's something incredibly authentic about it. So that was a long answer to the question, but I think there's parts of the world. So, for example, Jamaica are doing some really interesting stuff, creative stuff. As I said, the Balkans, a lot across Africa. I just wanted to keep going, and not everything will work. That's okay. Just keep the momentum going that this is becoming a movement. And if we do that, the world will be a better place, I reckon.
Yeah, I think one of the things that fascinates me about this discussion, and you used the word earlier, or I think both of us did, of belonging. I think if you have grown up in a country and never left it, it may be difficult to understand why somebody offshore would value belonging to that country. Do you see a lot of that? I know in an Irish context, I'm aware of it. The classic story is the Irish American shows up in Ireland and says, I'm here looking for my roots. And the Irish person goes, what? Who cares? Because if you're Irish, you've always been there. You're deeply rooted there. So I think maybe it's difficult for an Irish person who has deep roots in Ireland to understand the notion of uprootedness and why that becomes more important maybe for somebody whose family has washed up on various shores. Do you see that outside an Irish context, a similar kind of thing?
In terms of the thirst for belonging or the domestic response?
I think both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think both.
No, the thirst for belonging is incredible. And look, let me be the boring academic for a minute. There's a grounding for that when you begin to look at it. So there's a professor, I think he's at Stanford, Professor Jeffrey Cohen, who wrote a book on belonging. It's an incredible read if anybody is interested in kind of exploring further. But one of his core arguments over the last couple of years is that some of the great crises that we're facing in the world today, whether that's political division, economic inequality, is actually rooted in a crisis of belonging. And I think there's a validity to that. And there's another lady called Kim Samuel who created a Centre for Social Connectedness, and she's affiliated to Oxford University as well. And I paraphrase her definition, but I think it speaks to what you're talking about. She talks about belonging being a connection to a sense of people, power, place, and purpose tied into a shared commitment to a shared mission and outcome, which I think all sound positive to me. When you take a step back, I think to the second part of your question, one of the most underestimated yet critical elements of effective diaspora engagement is the domestic part of the equation. And what do I mean by the domestic part of the equation? Not just in terms of policy and structure, but the social tapestry of it. I remember having a chat with somebody that returned from London to Ireland many years ago. And just before they came back, which is not a large geographical leap, it's different when you talk about uprootedness, there's proximity there. But I remember she was telling me a story that when she came back to Ireland, she went down to the local bus stop and she asked the person at the bus stop, what time is the next bus? And the lady said, whenever it comes. You know? But at the time in London, just before she left and come home, they brought in the electronic timetables for the bus stops. And the lady that came home said to the lady back home, if you ever they were both home, they said, in London, we have these machines that tell you what time the bus comes, and the person waiting said, you know what you can do then? Off you go. But it sounds like a story, but there's layers to that, man. So I think what we have to do as well, and this was encouraging, we'll probably unpack it later, but we did a bit of research ahead of the new Irish diaspora strategy. So there was an option for organisations to submit position papers to help inform the strategy. And the country with the most respondents, it was a small number in terms of the position papers because the surveys themselves were quite prolific, but the country with the most submissions for the position papers was Ireland. So what we're also seeing in Ireland is a deepening awareness that this stuff is moving as well. And there's different types of engagements that we can have and different opportunities. So you do have to go around the domestic scene and make sure people are bought into it.
Yeah, we've been talking about diaspora. You said it's a kind of a new thinking or it's emerging thinking. But in the last exchange, you used the word engagement a lot. And I know you have a way of looking at diaspora engagement with 4 pillars, and that might help frame it up for us as to really what we're talking about as an action item here.
Yeah, so look, the 4 pillars and they flow across each other in different ways. Research, cultivation, asking, and stewardship. And what you want to get to when I say engagement, the magic of diaspora engagement is relationship-driven engagement. So what I often see from many countries is that they'll do the first 3, right? So the research is who are they, where are they, and what are they doing kind of stuff. And there's different ways now with technology that I think we have the answer to those questions for different types of diaspora engagement. Cultivation is listening. How do you just talk to your diaspora? They'll tell you what they want to do. I speak to government a lot, so that's where I come in with this piece, but kick back if you want me to talk about different actors in the journey as well. But quite often policies are designed based on what they think the diaspora could do, not what they will do. So the cultivation piece is actually getting into that engagement and listening. And the asking then is based on the learning of the listening, what we're going to design to actually try to activate this and get it going. And as I say, that doesn't always have to be government. It can be non-profits, it can be universities, it can be sporting organisations, or whatever it is. But if you think about it, lads, if you stop there, it's a very transactional engagement then, right? Because you're in it for yourself a little bit. Yeah. So the final piece is actually the most important part, stewardship. And I've learned this from the research back in the day in terms of diaspora philanthropy, but also just being in the field working with diasporas. Diasporas are clever. They have radars. Their BS radar is pretty strong. So if you come in with a transactional mindset, this million mile away. So what I would often say is that diasporas are actually quite often testing you in terms of their first engagement. There's an old saying is that the first gift or the first commitment is neither the largest or the last if you do the stewardship piece well. And I've seen that because what you don't want to happen if you're looking to engage a diaspora for any reason is that they feel taken for granted or they just feel like they're there to siphon something from them. The magic of this is how do you actually add authentic value to the journey that they're on. And that sounds a bit lofty and warm and fuzzy, but when it happens, coming back to the peace process, if you look at the trajectory of Ireland over the last 30 to 40, 50 years, you could probably make an argument that the 2 greatest success stories of the island have been achieving peace and advancing relative economic prosperity. But there's issues, as you said, in terms of access to opportunity in that economic story as well that I think we have to get better as a country addressing. But both of those stories, make no mistake about it, have pretty strong diaspora chapters to them. So that shows the magic of this.
So give me a practical example right now, and it doesn't matter which country we're talking about. I think, as you say, there's a transactional aspect of this, but to make it work, those transaction works from both parties, from the onshore versus offshore. So what's a good example of an engagement where both, I assume both should succeed?
Yeah,
right?
of course. Yeah.
So from an offshore and onshore point of view.
Yeah, look, I think it's linked to the question on countries as well, to go back to that. So there's an organization, for example, called In Diaspora that is building a network of the Indian diaspora, primarily in North America, but now expanding into the UK and across Europe. And they're working hand in hand with partners back in India. And some of that is government, some of it is not. And this is the difficulty, Martin, of what you're talking about. And that's cutting across climate change, AI, investment, social entrepreneurship, charitable causes. So I go to them because it shows the diversity of where the impact can come in diaspora engagement. I'm a big believer in diaspora and thinking. So what I often think to myself is, how can we unlock this for diaspora and technology? So I had a chat yesterday with one of the chaps involved with Digital Irish. That's a network that wouldn't have been here 20 or 30 years in Ireland because the technology world has fundamentally shifted and we need it now. So that's an example, I think, show the diversity. And I understand the difficulty in doing this because we live in a world of immediacy and short-termism. But look, you mentioned my own story. If people say to me, why do you do this, Marilyn? I want to build something for diaspora engagement that will last long when I'm gone. I remember sitting down with somebody when I began my career in this area, and I was a mentor, and I said, because I could have stayed in the academic world and looked at that route, and it's tempting because it's quite a comfortable gig if you do it well, in the sense of where you're going. But I remember asking a mentor a question. I said, can you show me a career pathway in diaspora engagement? And the answer was no. So I took it as a challenge to go and try and build it. So that's what I mean. If you can get these initiatives, when you talk about impact, it's not about the short term either. It's about how can you make these processes generational. That's the piece that I think we have to get better at in the sector. We have to be braver, more creative, more ambitious. That means we'll get our fingers burnt a couple of times. That's okay. Get back up, go again, kind of stuff. So that to me is the value. That to me is the impact if you can make it generational.
I brought up the thorny issue, like I pinned it on the North, but it's happening everywhere. And I refer to the incoming diaspora. But you have some interesting ways of talking about diaspora versus migration. And I saw it as migration as the language of borders, diaspora the language of belonging. Back to that word belonging.
I think sadly and incorrectly, when you look at the data, I think we kind of lost the word migration. I think it's been hijacked, to be frank. And I think it's going to be one hell of a battle to get it back, speaking openly, because definitionally they're different. Because migrants are part of a diaspora, but they're not the totality of the diaspora. So when you look at things like the UN definition, it's migrants and their descendants. And this is the piece, and I'll make the pitch now, because I have the microphone. I think we've underestimated how diaspora engagement can help migration. Now, think about it logically. There's been a hell of a lot of money spent on migration from different entities, public, private, I get all that. So definitionally, in 1990, I think was that there was 150 million migrants in the world. The World Migration Report was published, I think, just a couple of months ago. I was at the end of last year. And that is now 304 million migrants around the world, right? People living in a country outside that we're born in. So it's doubled. But think about this. Definitionally, diaspora is multiples of that. Yet diaspora gets a fraction of the funding and the attention than the migration. I just think the balance is off kilter. And I think what we have to be very brave on and courageous on, we cannot let the migratization of diaspora happen. And what I mean by that is all the ills of what you're talking to get sucked into the topic. So that's why I'm strategic as well. I'm trying to build a bit of distance between the two so that the diaspora concept and the work on diaspora engagement can actually help the other side. So that's how I tried to build a bit of space.
If you were to cast your eye, just turning back to Ireland, on, let's say, elements of diaspora benefits that are poorly understood from both offshore and onshore, where would you like to see deeper understanding being forged?
Brilliant question. I think we have to get much better at telling the story of the work of community leaders in this country helping the vulnerable Irish. I think there's a perception that everybody is in the land of glory and making a lot of money. I think we have a duty of care to people that are not in that situation. And I've been lucky enough to see some of that this week. So I don't think that's known at home. Let me put it that way.
Can you expand a bit on that experience?
Yeah, on one level it's inspiring, on one level it's heartbreaking, to be honest. So I think there's a layer of the community that will be facing traditional vulnerabilities, but new vulnerabilities as well. And it's not about acknowledging that as a weakness, but there's people at a later stage of life, maybe, that are not as visible as they can be. Let me put it that way. That I think we have a duty of care. I think we need to actually reinvest very strategically and pretty urgently in a stronger architecture of the Irish diaspora in the US. So one level I would say is that piece needs to be better told, but I also think we need to tell the story, or maybe what's underappreciated, I think, is the willingness of the diaspora to be an equal partner on this road for Ireland, not just domestically, but internationally. And that came through the research that we saw for the strategy. The diaspora was saying to us, we want more engagement. And the beauty of it, and dare I say it, is sometimes in life, the negativity could be a blessing in disguise. I think the geopolitical climate we're all working in and the geo-economic climate we're working in is making diasporas feel a little bit more exposed and vulnerable. And they're looking back to Ireland because it's familiar and it has a consistency and understanding to them. And I think they're willing to back that. And I think not just in an Irish context. So another story.
That's what we're here for.
I was at a dinner last week before I came over for an incredible nonprofit in California called the African Diaspora Network. There was people sitting around that table last week, lads, that wouldn't have been sitting around it 5 to 10 years ago. And I sensed a ferocious appetite to do something. I sensed a little bit of anger as well, which is okay, which is good if you channel it in the right way. And I'm seeing that across a lot of diasporas I work with not just in the US. I think the geopolitical shifts are firing up diasporas. And sometimes they can't be too public on it. And they're coming back to the different types of diaspora engagement. So I'm incredibly bullish on the future of this.
That's a good thing to be. As recently, Ireland's diaspora strategy came out for 2026 to 2030, and you have some involvement in this because I saw your graphs and charts in the last couple of pages of this nice-looking book. The idea of addressing the needs of the vulnerable comes out pretty strongly in this. It's one of the 5 threads that make up the tapestry. And that tapestry idea suggests that this is a weave of many parts and not a monolithic thing. So what is some of the thinking that you gleaned from this report?
So when we led the research piece that helped inform some elements of the strategy, I think to be fair to the government and to give them their dues, because it's not a popular thing to do in many parts of the world to give credit government credit at the moment. But we built a bit of a firewall between our research process and their outreach because you want to cross-reference in terms of what you're hearing in the different pieces. So there was consistency that built up. If you want to fast-track to reading the strategy and to directly answer your question, I think the first half of the strategy is really doubling down on what we've always done. But there was also a deep exploration and understanding that the environment in which this policy is arriving in, domestically, as well as internationally, is different. So I was joking with some friends. I was traveling with some diplomatic friends over to Washington in February. And I'm an avid reader, as I said earlier. So I was reading an academic book on the future of soft power, which was published in 2023. And I read about 6 or 7 chapters of it. And I came off the flight and I was 3 year old a date already.
Yeah.
So I have a message in that. So I did the thinking, I think the vulnerability piece, I think the culture, I think the tourism. But if you take a step back as well, this strategy, if you look at diaspora engagement in Ireland, let's take the last 2 years, but then expand it out a little bit to include another important strategy. So diaspora engagement has come up in our innovation and talent strategy. In the last 2 years, it's come up in our action plan for market diversification, which is a response to Brexit and tariffs and everything that's going on there. It's come up in our international sports diplomacy strategy, is the key pillar in there. It's come up in our big event strategies in the new tourism policy statement. So to answer another part of your question, because it's linked to what you said about the domestic piece, diaspora engagement as a policy initiative in Ireland, in a formal sense, is still relatively young. This is only the 3rd strategy of its kind. So we're still learning, but we're also looking at, to be fair to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that are out in the field delivering and executing and implementing on this. I just listed talent and innovation, sports, trade, tourism. That's a different policy architecture back home. So I think that'll be really interesting body of work to actually make this strategy thrive. How do we actually build that culture of collaboration across departments, across different actors in Ireland to make that work? So the cheat sheet, but the first half of the strategy to me really, as I said, doubles down on what we've always done and understanding the value of that and the importance of continuing it. So vulnerability, all that kind of stuff. The second half of the strategy is looking out into the world, the environment is coming from, and the type of initiatives we need to be doing to not just protect and secure Ireland, but to actually advance Ireland strategically, globally. So, for example, the final thread on sharing our experience is that non-competitive piece. I think it's a no-brainer diplomatically for Ireland to be doing this. I just listed 120 countries, the number of institutions that are working on it. There's a demand and a thirst for this knowledge. No other country probably has a political context that makes us acceptable as much as Ireland. To put that up. So that's where I'm passionate within the strategy, but the other piece is it also, but how do we build Irish networks in multinationals? How do we build Irish networks in multilaterals? I had an incredible coffee this morning with an Irish lady working in the UN peace building office. We've Irish people everywhere. Connect them and get out of the way when you connect them.
I encountered relatively recently ITMA, which is the Irish Musical Archive, and they did a session in the Irish Consulate where they're putting together an atlas, a digital atlas of music experiences, specifically Irish traditional music. And they have accumulated a history and then attached it to the geography so you can actually navigate that. And it strikes me that there's these opportunities for opting in to the network rather than, let's say people are very wary right now of their data being extracted, whereas I'm happy to proffer my data and my willingness to engage. I think there's a huge opportunity there in terms of how do we make a tool so people become more accessible to each other, and then surround that with programming that educates people, or educates sounds too top down, exposes people to new ideas. Maybe that could be really helpful, in their experience.
You folks shouldn't be humble either in this. Well, what you're talking about there as well, Meredith, is the power of the storytelling and to activate a little bit of self-interest for people. People want to get engaged for stuff they're interested in, and that's great. And we've worked with countries around the world that say, we want to create a database of our diaspora, and they create a portal where people sign up, but they're never going to sign up because there's nothing in it for them. And as you say, they're nervous about where the data is going to end up. And don't get me wrong, look, I generally work well with officialdom because I have to as part of my work. But if I was living in the diaspora and I got a phone call from the government saying, who are you, where are you, what are you doing? I'm hanging up the phone pretty quick. That's what I mean about, we have to begin to think about how media could be that point of contact in terms of diaspora media, how diaspora content and programming can be part of that buy-in point or people want to engage with. And the best example of this is LinkedIn. We had a chat with LinkedIn recently. I think there's about 1.3 billion people on LinkedIn. Why? That's the question. You know what I mean? Because there's something in it for them. So I think if you can create the programming, create the vehicles where you can have security as well. I think people want to know that when they engage and they're going to give on the data side of it, it's for the right purpose and for the right output.
Just to wrap here, and glancing back at this Diaspora Strategy Report, the strategy has 23 commitments. And this is where things tend to fall down at times. And you strike me as someone who's interested in academic theory and somebody who wants to see things get done. So looking ahead a year from now, what would you like to see has happened already that comes out of this report that feels like progress?
For Ireland, the US, or generally?
However you want to look at it.
Yeah, look, I think that domestic piece that I talked about, because I think that will be the heartbeat to make the other stuff work. So that collaboration, I think that needs to get done quickly and effectively. What I would love to see happen in the kind of short term is that more strategic layering of the diaspora and understanding of how that works and the type of actors that we need to make that happen. So for example, where do the Ireland funds fit in this? Where do folks like Digital Irish fit in this? Where do you, because I think
Irish stew, where does that
exactly, because no, we didn't unpack this there. I'll talk to the academic theory. Power has shifted. One of my favorite speeches last year, I think it was a lady, the new head of MI6, I think that's what I was calling her with this, and she was talking about power generally in the technological age. And one of her core arguments in terms of the technological age, she says that power has shifted historically over the last kind of 10, 15 from the state to the corporation. And that's really recalibrated the balance, and you can see that on many different levels. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. I think it's back to the data piece that they talked about. But she said coming downstream, and it's happening already, in the technological age, it's going to diffuse from the state to the corporation to the individual. So to answer your question on the strategy, I think we have to reconfigure and reframe, but actively and assertively build this. We need to build new networks of power around the world. And I think that's not going to be solely government-led. This comes back to the mission at hand in terms of making this last for the diaspora. I think that's an incredibly powerful ask of the diaspora. And the data from the research that we're seeing, the diaspora are telling us they're willing to do it. So now it's on us to make sure we don't miss the opportunity.
I'm going to shoehorn one more question in. Within the Irish American community, of which I am proudly part, there is a concern of diaspora fade. In other words, the generations, the removal, if you will, from Ireland is getting longer and longer. There isn't a big influx of Irish people into America anymore. So I am to some degree the last of a generation, and my hair is thinning and it is getting grayer. What would your recommendation be to strengthen and deepening the ties in the face of this fade?
Quick answer is don't let it happen, be active. I think we need, when I talk about the investment in the architecture, I think we need a space where we're actually projecting what the future of Ireland and the Irish diaspora in the US is over the next 100 to 150 years. And I think we need to be having those conversations now, and we need to be investing in it that way. And as I said, that doesn't have to come through a university. That can come through platforms like Irish do, but I think it needs to be formal. And I think we need to be much more assertive on it. Because what you want to do as well is, when we talk about activating the belonging, you have to give people the inspiration to be part of what you're trying to achieve. It's so critical. And if you take it for granted or you let the fade set in, it's harder to do it at that stage. I think we're entering a critical couple of years here, lads, to be honest, from what I've seen this week and from what I saw in the research and the report. And we've been, as I said, the kind of geopolitical shift. I think it's time to make big moves from not just Ireland Inc., but I think Ireland industry leaders, Ireland investors, Irish philanthropists, diaspora philanthropists. And I don't mean just when I say Irish in America, Irish American, we're all one family. So that's where I would be going. And I think the strategy can only do some of that. All of that is not the job of government alone. So that's where I would go with it.
Fortunately, Brand Ireland is pretty strong, and we're happy to always have a chance to promote it in a way. And this is the point in the program where we like to give you a chance to promote something in your shameless plug.
I'd love to plug the team we have at TDI. Because look, myself and Kingsley get out and get to talk a lot, but there's an incredible group of people behind us, so they don't get the light that they deserve. Let me put it that way, over many times. But my final plug is the community leaders on the front line, from helping the vulnerable, from helping those that need it, from helping young entrepreneurs, old entrepreneurs. I think they're the people, we need to clone them and keep going. That would be my shameless plug.
Very good. Thank you. Well said.
John, a lot of meat on the bone in that conversation, so I'm going to put in the show notes links to various books and organizations that Martin Russell referred to, so listeners can drill into this particular area. I think diaspora has become a word that's become much more common in the whole Irish conversation, and getting to grips with that in a better way is really going to help across multiple dimensions. We all know about the diaspora helping out, let's say, in Irish independence. The American diaspora supported the 1916 Rising and then the War for Independence. And more recently, the peace in Northern Ireland probably wouldn't have happened without leveraging the diaspora. What makes Ireland unique is simply the scale of the diaspora relative to the size of the country. We're talking about 70 million people here. That's 70 million different opportunities for people to engage with Ireland.
And one of those links will go to the 2026-2030 Irish Diaspora Strategy that Dr. Martin Russell worked on, and he actually gets a closing word at the end of the document. He was great to talk to. Our thing is conversation for the global Irish nation. That global part, that diaspora part, that threads through so many of our discussions here on Irish Stew. What I really liked was the way Martin Russell address the flip side of diaspora right now, which is migration. And he talked about the diaspora being the language of belonging and migration, the language of borders. So sometimes it's very helpful to keep your languages separate or to understand how both of them work independently and also work together. So he's a man who puts together a very nice phrase to explain what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And I think there's probably no conversation that we could have that's more on point with what we're trying to do on Irish Stew. Before our credits, we'd like to ask our listeners, if you liked what you heard today, don't rely on algorithms to bring that story to you. Sign up for the Irish Stew newsletter. We'll drop episodes straight into your inbox. Head over to irishstewpodcast.com. You'll see a sign-up form on our front page. Make sure you don't miss out as new episodes keep on coming.
Tilt the algorithm in our favor. And some folks who are tilting things in our favor right now are Irish Central, leading a global diaspora news site for all things Irish. And they've been kind enough to include our episodes with a nice story, usually landing on the front page and then archived there from here to eternity, we hope. irishcentral.com. Please include that in your web browsing.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Martin Nutty. Additional editing by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer,
For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.